You don't notice the paper at first, because men like you are trained not to notice anything that doesn't scream for attention. But something about it pulls your eyes back as you pass the board. As if the ink itself is heavier than the rest. As if those 3 letters SAS carry a gravity that bends your thoughts around them. And suddenly the noise of the barracks fades, the conversations blur. And all that exists is that single sheet of white with black text daring you to step closer. For 3 years you've imagined this moment without admitting it out loud, replaying it in quiet spaces during long marches, in the seconds before sleep when the mind stops lying. And now that it's here, it feels less like a decision and more like something inevitable, something already decided long before your hand reaches out, long before your fingers press into the paper and tear it free from the board with a sound that feels louder than it should, like a line being crossed that you can never uncross. Rain greets you outside, cold and indifferent, soaking through your uniform, if the world itself is testing your resolve before you've even begun. And for a brief moment you wonder if this is the last simple moment you'll have for a long time. The last moment where the only weight you carry is the one in your pocket instead of the one that's about to be strapped to your back, and yet you keep walking. Because stopping now would mean admitting that the thought of what's ahead is stronger than you are, and that's not something you're willing to accept. Sterling Lines doesn't welcome you when you arrive, because places like this don't care about your expectations or your nerves or your past achievements. And as you stand among 200 other men, each one carrying his own version of the same silent question, you realize quickly that nobody here is interested in who you were before today, because everything that mattered ended the moment you stepped through that gate. There is no speech, no build-up, no moment to settle into the idea of what you've signed up for. Only a command delivered without emotion, without explanation, and suddenly you're moving, lifting a burden that feels heavier than its weight suggests, as if it's filled not just with gear, but with every doubt you've ever tried to ignore, pressing down on your shoulders with a force that makes you question whether this was ambition or stupidity. The hills rise in front of you like something alive, something watching, something waiting to see how long it takes before you break. And as you step into them, the world shrinks to the rhythm of your breathing, the scrape of your boots against wet ground, and the constant, grinding awareness that every step forward is a choice you have to make again and again, because nothing here carries you forward except your own refusal to stop. Fog swallows everything, reducing the world to a few meters in every direction, isolating you in a way that feels almost personal, like the mountain is stripping away distractions until all that remains is you and the weight and the distance you still have to cover. And in that isolation, the mind starts to speak louder than it ever has before, asking questions you don't want to answer, offering exits you don't want to see. Men begin to disappear, not dramatically, not with speeches or final words, but quietly, one by one, as if they were never really part of this to begin with. And that's what unsettles you the most, not the difficulty, not the pain, but how easily someone can go from being here to being gone, as if the line between those two states is thinner than you ever imagined. Your body starts to fail in small ways at first, subtle signs that grow harder to ignore. Skin breaking under pressure, muscles tightening until movement becomes something you have to force rather than something that happens naturally, and every sensation becomes sharper, more immediate, as if your body is trying to convince you to stop before something worse happens. But the worst part isn't the pain, it's the silence from those in charge. The complete absence of feedback, because without it, you have no idea if you're doing well or failing, if you're ahead or behind, and that uncertainty becomes its own kind of pressure, a constant background noise that never lets you settle into any sense of confidence. Time stretches in strange ways out here, minutes feeling like hours, hours collapsing into moments, until the concept of how long you've been moving stops mattering, and all that remains is the distance between where you are and where you need to be. A distance that never seems to shrink as quickly as you want it to. By the time you reach the later stages, you've stopped thinking in terms of finishing and started thinking in terms of not quitting, because the idea of the end feels too far away to hold onto, too abstract to motivate you, while the act of continuing, of taking one more step, is immediate, tangible, something you can control even when everything else feels out of your hands. When the long drag comes, it doesn't feel like a challenge anymore. It feels like a confrontation, a final attempt by the process to strip away anything that doesn't belong, and as you step into it, carrying everything you have left across a distance that seems designed to expose every weakness you've been hiding, you realize that this isn't about proving strength. It's about refusing to surrender to the voice that tells you to stop. The finish doesn't feel like victory when it finally comes, because there's no celebration waiting for you, no moment of recognition that matches the effort you've given, only the quiet understanding that you've made it through something that most never will. And even that understanding feels fragile, as if it could disappear the moment you let yourself relax. And yet, there's no time to hold on to it, because the next phase begins before the last one has fully settled, pulling you into environments that test you in completely different ways, replacing cold with heat, isolation with constant discomfort, physical strain with the kind of exhaustion that eats at your ability to think clearly, to make decisions, to function as part of something larger than yourself. You learn quickly that this process isn't about creating something new. It's about revealing what was already there, stripping away everything unnecessary until only the essential remains. And that realization changes the way you see every moment, every challenge, every decision, because it's no longer about becoming someone else. It's about proving that you already are who you need to be. And somewhere along the way, without a clear moment marking the shift, the question changes. No longer asking whether this is worth it, but whether you're willing to see it through to the end, no matter what that end looks like, no matter what it costs, because by now, turning back would mean more than just quitting. It would mean undoing everything you've already endured, and that's a price you're no longer willing to pay. And the strange thing is that at some point, without any ceremony or clear transition, the suffering stops feeling like something being done to you and starts feeling like something you are actively choosing, as if every blister, every breath, every step forward becomes a quiet agreement between you and the part of yourself that refuses to be ordinary. And that realization is both empowering and terrifying, because it means there is no one left to blame if you fail. You begin to understand that the process is not testing your limits in the way you once imagined. It is testing your relationship with those limits, probing how you respond when your body screams for relief and your mind offers you an exit, measuring whether you negotiate with discomfort or dominate it. And that subtle difference becomes the line that separates those who endure from those who disappear. The jungle does not welcome you any more than the mountains did, but its hostility is different, quieter in some ways yet more invasive, because here the discomfort doesn't come in waves. It settles into your skin, your lungs, your thoughts, wrapping around you like the humidity that never lifts, making every movement heavier, every breath thicker, every second a reminder that you are operating in an environment that does not want you there. Sleep becomes something abstract, something you remember more than something you experience. Because even when your eyes close, your body never fully relaxes, your senses never fully shut down, and you start to exist in this strange state where exhaustion becomes your baseline rather than your breaking point, forcing you to function not at your best, but at your most resilient. And it's here, in this relentless environment, that you begin to see the others differently, no longer as competitors or strangers, but as reflections of the same struggle, each man carrying his own weight, his own doubts, his own silent battles, and the way he handles them tells you more about him than any introduction ever could. You watch how they react when things go wrong, how they speak when they're tired, how they move when no one is watching, and without realizing it, you're being watched in the same way. Every action becoming part of an unspoken evaluation that never pauses, never softens, never forgives. There are moments when your body feels like it's operating on instinct alone, when your mind drifts just enough to make you question how you're still moving, how you're still thinking, how you're still here, and in those moments you catch a glimpse of something deeper, something beyond training or experience, something that can't be taught but only revealed under pressure. Hunger sharpens everything, turning simple thoughts into obsessions, making the idea of food feel almost unreal in its absence. And yet even that becomes something you adapt to, something you learn to push aside in favor of the task in front of you, because here, survival is not about comfort, it's about focus. And then comes the phase that strips away even the illusion of control, where you are hunted, where every movement carries risk, where every decision could bring you closer to success and everything you've endured up to this point, and suddenly the stakes feel immediate in a way they haven't before. Because now it's not just about endurance, it's about precision. You move through terrain with a level of awareness you didn't know you possessed. Every sound analyzed, every shadow questioned, every instinct sharpened to a point where hesitation becomes as dangerous as recklessness. And in this state, you realize how much of your previous life was spent unaware and tested, unchallenged. When capture comes, because it always comes eventually, it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels inevitable, like the final piece of a process that has been building toward this moment from the very beginning. And as you're stripped of comfort, of identity, of control, you're forced into a confrontation with yourself that is more psychological than physical. Time loses meaning in that space, reduced to sensations, to pressure, to the constant effort of maintaining something as simple as silence. And in that silence, you discover just how powerful words can be, how dangerous they are when released carelessly, how valuable they become when withheld with intention. You learn that resilience is not loud, it's not dramatic, it doesn't announce itself. It exists in the quiet refusal to give in the decision to hold the line even when no one is watching, even when no one would blame you for breaking. And that realization changes the way you see strength forever. When it ends, there is no moment of triumph, no release of tension that matches what you've endured. Only the quiet transition back into a world that feels almost unfamiliar after everything you've been through. As if you've crossed into something that can't be fully explained to anyone who hasn't experienced it. And when they hand you the barrett, when they place that symbol into your hands, it doesn't feel like a reward, it feels like a responsibility. A weight that carries more meaning than any words could express. Because you understand now what it took to get here, and more importantly, what it will take to stay here. There is no pause, no moment to settle into your new identity, because the process doesn't end. It evolves, shifting from selection to preparation, from proving yourself to maintaining a standard that never lowers, never relaxes, never allows complacency to take root. Training becomes more precise, more focused, more dangerous, because now the margin for error is measured in consequences that extend beyond yourself. And every skill you learn carries the implicit understanding that one day you may have to rely on it in a situation where failure is not an option. You begin to see how everything connects, how the endurance built in the mountains supports the clarity required in complex operations, how the discipline learned in silence becomes essential in moments of chaos, how the ability to function under pressure becomes the foundation for everything that follows. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, you realize that the version of yourself who stood in front of that notice board feels distant, almost unrecognizable. Not because you've become someone completely different, but because you've stripped away so much of what you once thought mattered that only the core remains. You no longer seek validation, because there is none to be found here. No audience, no applause, no acknowledgement beyond the quiet trust of the men beside you. And that trust becomes more valuable than anything you could have imagined before you started this journey. Operations begin to feel less like missions and more like extensions of everything you've been trained for, moments where preparation meets reality, where decisions carry weight in ways that training can only simulate. And in those moments, you understand why the process was so unforgiving. You learn to move without hesitation, to decide without doubt, to act without the need for confirmation, because the environment demands it, and the people around you rely on it. And that reliance becomes the strongest motivator of all, stronger than ambition, stronger than fear. There are nights when everything goes according to plan, when precision and timing align perfectly, when the operation unfolds exactly as it was designed, and those nights pass quietly, without recognition, without acknowledgement, fading into memory as just another task completed. And then there are nights when nothing goes as expected, when variables shift, when uncertainty takes control, when the situation forces you to adapt in ways that no plan could have predicted. And it's in those moments that you discover whether everything you've learned is enough. You carry those moments with you, not as stories to tell, but as lessons that shape how you think, how you act, how you lead, and over time they build into something that can't be taught, something that can only be earned through experience. Leadership stops being about authority and becomes about responsibility, about making decisions that affect others in ways that extend far beyond the immediate moment. And that responsibility becomes heavier with time, not lighter, because the more you understand, the more you realize what's at stake. And still, despite everything, despite the weight, the risk, the constant demand for more, you keep moving forward, not because it's easy, not because it's rewarding in the way most people understand, but because somewhere along the way you've come to accept that this is where you belong. This is where you are most fully yourself. And in the rare quiet moments, when the noise fades and the pressure lifts just enough for you to think, you remember that piece of paper, that single decision, that moment that seemed so small at the time, and you realize that everything that followed was contained within it, waiting to unfold the moment you chose not to walk past. And what begins to settle into your mind, slowly at first and then with a clarity that cannot be ignored, is the understanding that there was never a finish line in the way you once imagined. No moment where everything would suddenly make sense and the wait would feel justified. Because the truth is far less comforting and far more demanding, which is that the wait itself is the purpose. The constant pressure is the environment in which this version of you exists, and without it, you would not recognize yourself anymore. You notice it in the way your thoughts have changed, in the way hesitation no longer lingers where it once did, replaced instead by a kind of quiet decisiveness that feels almost automatic, as if the countless moments of uncertainty you endured have trained your mind to move forward without waiting for reassurance, without searching for permission, because you now understand that in the environments you operate in, waiting is often more dangerous than acting. There is a shift that happens when you stop viewing discomfort as something to endure and start viewing it as something to navigate, like terrain that can be understood, anticipated, and managed rather than feared. And that shift changes everything, because it removes the emotional resistance that once made every challenge feel heavier than it needed to be. The men around you are no longer just teammates. They are variables you have learned to read with precision, each one carrying strengths and weaknesses that reveal themselves in subtle ways, in the way they move under pressure, in the way they communicate without words, in the way they respond when plans begin to unravel. And that awareness becomes critical because your survival is no longer tied solely to your own performance, but to the collective efficiency of the group. Trust, you realize, is not built through words or shared experiences alone. It is built through consistency under stress, through the repeated demonstration that when things go wrong, you will not be the one who breaks, and over time, that trust forms a kind of unspoken bond that is stronger than anything that could be explained or written down. There are moments when the pace slows just enough for reflection to slip in. Moments where you catch yourself thinking about the life you left behind, the simplicity of it, the predictability, the way problems once felt significant before you understood what real stakes looked like. And in those moments, you feel a strange distance from that version of yourself, not out of arrogance, but out of recognition that you no longer operate within the same framework. You begin to understand why so few people choose this path and why even fewer remain on it. Because it demands a level of commitment that goes beyond motivation or ambition. It requires a willingness to continuously confront yourself, to expose your weaknesses, to operate in environments where excuses have no value and results are the only currency that matters. And yet, despite the intensity, despite the constant demand for more, there is a clarity in this life that you have never experienced before. A simplicity that exists within the complexity. Because everything is reduced to its essential components: mission, team, execution, survival. And within that reduction, there is no room for the distractions that once consumed your attention. You start to notice how quickly situations evolve, how a plan that felt solid moments ago can dissolve into something completely different, forcing you to adapt in real time, to make decisions based not on what you expected, but on what is actually happening. And that adaptability becomes one of your most valuable skills. Because rigidity in this environment is a liability. There are nights where the silence feels heavier than the action, where the waiting stretches on longer than expected, where the anticipation builds in a way that tests your focus more than any physical challenge ever could, and it is in those moments that discipline reveals itself not as something dramatic, but as the ability to remain steady when nothing is happening, to stay ready without becoming restless. And then, without warning, everything accelerates, the calm replaced by movement, by urgency, by decisions that must be made instantly, and you transition into that state without hesitation. Because the line between preparation and execution has blurred to the point where they are no longer separate phases, but parts of the same continuous process. You learn to trust your training in a way that feels almost instinctive, relying on repetition and experience to guide your actions, when there is no time to think through every detail. And that trust becomes essential because the margin for error is often smaller than you realize, until it's already too late. There are consequences to this life that are not immediately visible, things that don't reveal themselves in the moment but linger in the background, shaping the way you think, the way you react, the way you see the world, and over time you begin to recognize that the cost of operating at this level is not just physical or professional, it is deeply personal. You carry experiences that cannot be shared easily, not because you are unwilling to talk about them, but because the context required to understand them simply does not exist outside of the environments in which they occurred. And that creates a kind of separation between you and the rest of the world that is difficult to articulate. But within the regiment, within the group of men who have walked the same path, that separation disappears, replaced by an understanding that requires no explanation, no elaboration, because everyone there has felt the same pressures, faced the same uncertainties, made the same kinds of decisions under the same kinds of conditions.